is just kind of give people a glimpse of the actual American patriotic tradition, which is as the enabler of a modern, powerful China. That's the tradition. That's our tradition. The actual American tradition is to enable the development of a powerful, modern China. Everything else is hogwash and crap. So all this other stuff that you see today is not American. It's all un-American. It's all garbage. So I'm going to start from the end of the class, and then we're going to go backwards. So this is the end of this class. It's actually the beginning of another class. So you'll see what I mean. This is Anson Burlingame. Anson Burlingame was Lincoln's hand-picked minister to China. He was the minister to China throughout the entirety of the Civil War. And he was the minister to China throughout the Johnson administration after the assassination of Lincoln. In 1868, the United States signed a treaty with China. Now, does anybody have an idea of what the situation was with China in 1868?
Drug war.
Two opium wars and the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion was like, if you imagine Falun Gong going wild in China and ripping it apart for 5 years, you get an idea what the Taiping Rebellion was. It was a fundamentalist cult, anti-Confucian, right? It basically a bunch of fundamentalists, Christian fundies, sponsored by the British.
Oh my God.
Right? And it was a war. It was a shooting war. And after the whole thing was over in 1864, any idea how many people were dead between famine and war? 30 to 30 million people, 20 to 30 million Chinese. Anybody know the population of China in 1860?
90 billion.
400 million. So China, by this period, by 1865, by the end of the U.S. Civil War, 1866-67, is devastated, absolutely devastated. It's being raped by all sorts of foreign powers. So the United States steps in and signs a treaty that basically says, you are our most favored nation. You have equal treaty rights with us. We're opening up our ports for your consuls to come in and set up embassies. Any Chinese can come to the United States and have equal rights to live here in the United States, set up homes, etc. And then, it's reciprocal. And Americans can go to China, etc. Burlingame then retires as the minister to China and takes a group of Chinese government officials and tours the entire world, going capital to capital to capital to capital, saying, hey you, London, hey you, Paris, you guys should do the same thing. This is a sovereign nation. This is a great people. This is how they should be treated. And I'm going to read you, and he gave speeches everywhere. I'm going to read you a little section of a speech, and just listen to this and hear how we would be saying the same thing today. We, the Labor Committee, we. He says this. China, emerging from the midst of time, but yesterday suddenly entered your western gates and confronts you by its representatives here tonight. This is in New York, and he's got all these guys with him. They're all sitting there giving this speech. What have you to say to her? She comes with no menace on her lips. She comes with the great doctrine of Confucius, uttered 2,300 years ago. Do unto others what you would not have others do unto you. Will you not respond with the more positive doctrine of Christianity? We will do unto others what we would have others do unto us. She asks you to forget your ancient prejudices, to abandon your assumptions of superiority. She wishes no war. She asks that you will respect the neutrality of her waters and the integrity of her territory. I say that this is a great and noble people. It has all the elements of a splendid nationality. It has the most numerous people on the face of the globe. It has the most homogeneous people in the world. Its language is spoken by more human beings than any other in the world. And it is written in the rock. It is a country where there is greater unification of thought than in any other country in the world. It is a country where the maxims of the great sages coming down memorized have permeated the whole people until their knowledge is rather an instinct than an acquirement. It is a people loyal while living and whose last prayer when dying is to sleep in the sacred soil of their fathers. It is a land of scholars and of schools, a land of books, from the smallest pamphlet up to the voluminous encyclopedias. It is a land, sirs, as you have said, where the privileges are common. It is a land without caste, for they destroyed their feudal system 2,100 years ago, and they built up their great structure of civilization on the great idea that the people are the source of the power. It's Tian Xiao that we always talk about. People are the source of the power. That idea was uttered by Mencius more than 2,000 years ago, and it was old when he uttered it. The power flows forth from the people into practical government through the cooperative system, and they make scholarship a test of merit. I say it is a great, a polite, a patient, a sober, and industrious people. And it is such a people as this that the bitter boor would exclude from the council hall of nations. It is such a nation as this that the tyrannical element would put under its ban. They say that all these people, a third of the human race, must become the weak wards of the West, wards of nations not so populous as many of their provinces, wards of people who are younger than their newest village in Manchuria. I do not mean to say that the Chinese are perfect, far from it. They have their faults, their pride, their prejudices, like other people. These are profound. They must be overcome. They have their conceits, like other people, and they must be done away with. But they are not to be removed by talking to them with cannon, by telling them that they are feeble and weak, and that they are barbarians. The country is open. You may travel and trade where you like. What complaint have you to make of her? Show her, I say, fair play. Exhibit that to her, and you will bless the toiling millions of the world. That trade, which has in my own day in China risen from 82 millions to 300 millions, is but a tithe of the enormous trade that may be carried on with China in the future. The imagination kindles at the future which may be and will be, if you will be just and fair to China. And just to get an idea, this is from a different speech. But he says, why should we not exchange our sublime doctrines, our thoughts with China? Why should we not have the moral maxims of Confucius and Mencius? And you, he's now talking to Chinese, and you, the sublime doctrines of Christianity. Why should we not take your charming manners, you Chinese, your temperance, your habits of scholarship, and your high culture, and our modern sciences, our railroads and telegraphs, our steamboats? Why should not this great nation, the mother of inventions, whence come paper, printing, porcelain, the compass, gunpowder, and the great doctrine of the people are the source of the power, Tian Xiao Wei Gun, follow up their inventions and principles and enjoy them in all their development? You get the idea, right? So it's very clear, it's very conscious that we're talking about a dialogue of civilizations here between the United States and this Confucian culture. You see here the delegation. Now, accompanying this is a campaign. In other words, we're not talking about just a treaty that's signed here, and that's all very nice. This is a concerted campaign by the Lincoln Republicans. Accompanying this is a book that comes out in 1870 by one of these missionaries that we're going to talk about that in a bit, named William Spear, and it's called. This is somewhat of a polemic, but he calls it the oldest and the newest empire, China and the United States. So he calls it an empire, but anyway. This book is like 700 pages. And it's like your encyclopedia handbook to China. And it's like a whole history of China and the people and the whole thing, right? And in it is the Burlingame Treaty. In it is the speech that I read from. It's got a quote here from Seward. By the way, the Burlingame Treaty was basically written by Seward.
Ah,
Seward was the Secretary of State. That was,
what
of
year
course,
again was that?
68, 1868. Seward went on to become the Secretary of State under Johnson.
Really?
Yeah.
So he recovered from
Yeah,
China.
yeah. And his nephew, George Seward, became the career diplomat to China. So it's like a whole continuation. And there's a very famous quote here from Seward. While the Pacific Ocean, its shores, its islands, and the vast regions beyond, he basically says the Pacific is going to become the chief theater of events in the world hereafter. This is a famous speech that Seward gave on the floor of the Senate in 1852. Right? So Seward was a big proponent of the expansion of the United States into the Pacific. And Speer is like, you know, he basically says the future of the world is the United States and China. And he's a big proponent of Chinese immigration into the United States, into California. So this book went through something like, I don't know, 20 different editions. I've been trying to find out like how many it sold, and I haven't gotten it yet. But it was a big deal to promote the Burlingame Treaty, Chinese immigration, and this built the railroads, folks. I mean, this is what allowed Chinese immigration in the United States. There's a new book that just came out I'm trying to get a hold of on this whole thing, Chinese building the railroads. Okay, so where did all this come from? Now, just to remind you, that's Ben Franklin.
Wow.
This is 1737. Ben Franklin used to publish his Pennsylvania Gazette. In the 17th century, a very popular book was printed called The Morals of Confucius. Has anybody ever read the Analects, Confucian Analects? Seen it?
Yes.
It's one of the most popular. Yeah, it was basically put together by Confucius's disciples. And it's a lot of the sayings, a lot of dialogue between Confucius and his followers, called the Analects. And the Morals of Confucius was an English translation of sections of the Analects, and it was published in 1691. So this was widely available throughout the English-speaking world in the colonies. So Franklin printed sections of this in his Pennsylvania Gazette. And he referenced this in letters. So he was quite knowledgeable of Confucius and a big fan of Confucius. But what I'm going to focus on is something a little bit different. And I always start with this quote, because this was the thinking of the real Patriots. This is from a speech that John Quincy Adams gave on the July 4th anniversary. He's talking to veterans, American Revolutionary War veterans. He says, in the conflict of 7 years, the history of the war by which you maintained the Declaration of Independence became the history of the civilized world. It was the first solemn declaration by a nation of the only legitimate foundation of civil government. It was the cornerstone of a new fabric destined to cover the surface of the globe. It demolished at a stroke the lawfulness of all governments founded upon conquest. It swept away all the rubbish of accumulated centuries of servitude. Okay? It was the cornerstone of a new fabric destined to cover the surface of the globe. So this is the thinking of the real Patriots, right? This doesn't just stop here. This is a revolutionary new physical principle, and this is going to be the principle that covers the entire planet. That's the idea of a missionary. I mean, think of the Winthrops coming over here. We're going to the city upon the hill. Right? We're going to build a civilization of a new type. Right? A republic of a new type. So, what happens is...
who was that speech again?
Where?
Yeah.
I don't know. In 1810, there's an organization established by John Quincy Adams, John Jay, And this fellow is extremely important. I'll talk about a little bit, named Jedediah Morse, who's the father of Samuel Morse. And Boudinot, I'll talk about him a little bit, called the American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions. So this is a Christian missionary, foreign missionary movement to send American missionaries abroad to foreign lands, ostensibly to convert, to spread the word of Christianity. But it's a lot more than that, right? It's a lot more than that. Okay, so who are these people? John Quincy Adams, you know, right? What's he interested in?
Trade.
No, he's interested in spreading the American Revolution, covering the surface of the globe, right? With the ideas of the American Revolution.
And crushing the paradigm of empire.
Yeah, absolutely, right? John Jay is the first Chief Justice of the United States, right? These guys all are on the inner circle. Both of these guys are in George Washington's inner circle. John Jay was in the committee to detect conspiracies during the Revolution.
Wow.
That was his job
Huh.
in the Continental Congress, which means
There are
he was
no
on the inside of the intelligence operations. Elias Boudinot, his father was a close collaborator with Benjamin Franklin. Boudinot was the one where Alexander Hamilton lived with in New Jersey when he first came here from the islands as a youngster.
This one or the father?
No, no, him.
Yeah.
Both of them.
Yeah.
It's the family. And this Boudinot was the commissar of prisoners in the Revolution. You know what that means, right? All the British prisoners that are captured, you interview. So again, top intelligence. He was handpicked by Washington to be that. So again, these are top intelligence operatives. So these are not just Bible thumping, hey, I'm going to be a missionary people, right? John Jay also was the founder of the American Bible Society, which is right in Manhattan next to the New York Institute of Technology, where we had a meeting. Yeah. So you see, this is, think of it, if you think of an American missionary, think of the Winthrop fleet. That's the idea of missionary. They're Christians, very profound Christians, but they're out to spread a very specific kind of message. They're out to think of essays to do good. Think of Cotton Mather. That's the idea of an American missionary, right? Imitation of Christ. Okay, now I have to mention and then there's Jedediah Morse. This is an absolutely unique person. Morse is a theologian. He's a linguist. He's a geographer. This guy is a Renaissance man. Again, he's the father of Samuel F.B. Morse. And I have to mention one thing about this, because where all this comes out of. I don't know if anybody's maybe familiar with this, if you know the history. There's a fierce battle that occurs in the beginning of the 19th century, the Unitarian controversy. Anybody know anything about this?
In Boston?
Yeah,
Yeah.
in Massachusetts. It's a big battle. What happens is there's a real nasty form of Unitarianism that's brought in by the British and the Brahmins in 1805 by this guy, William Ellery Channing. And it's an explicit attack on the Trinity. So they basically said, forget about it, Jesus, he's not divine, he's just a regular guy. There's God up here, there's no divine Trinity, blah, 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 blah. And everybody knows where that leads, right? This basically says you're a piece of crap. And every oligarchical form. Yeah, well, who are the big sponsors of it, right? The Brahmins, the Lowells, right? The slave traders, the opium traders, right? And that ends up being what it is. This is the Newburyport crowd. This is the Hartford Convention crowd. That's their religion, right? And so they take over the Harvard Theological School, whatever it's called. Harvard School.
Was this fight in the open, like are
Oh,
there
totally.
things
Oh, yeah,
written
there's pamphlets back and forth between him and Morse. This huge public battle for 5 years, back and forth. And all the ministers are involved, and fights in the pulpits. It's a huge public battle, right? And so Morse and a bunch of other followers who end up setting up the American, the CFM, set up a separate theological seminary in Andover Theological Seminary. And out of Andover come all of the people that compose the ABCFM, American Board of Commissioners of Foreign Missions, right? So they come out of this fierce battle over fundamental issues, theological issues, and fight against the Brahmins directly. And Quincy Adams is directly involved in this. So I just want to point that out.
The Unitarians took over the Harvard,
Yeah,
Harvard theological, what's
The Brahmins.
or the
yeah,
Brahmins?
yeah, Unitarian.
Same thing.
Same period when they threw him out of the.
And this is while they're trying to split the union. So this is all super political. This is not, So just to give you an idea of what Morse is like, just read you one quote, just to give you an idea how he thinks. I'll read that in a second. Here's a quote. He says, he's talking about British society. Morse says, British society is divided into king, nobility, and people. Their system, therefore, has for its basis social distinctions and recognizes not only the justness and propriety of these distinctions, but also the separate rights and privileges which appertain to these different and artificial classes, and attempts to maintain and preserve their separate rights and privileges. The basis of their system is the inequality, and the basis of ours is the equality of mankind in their social character and relations, as well as in their natural rights. Their system is designed to maintain and regulate an unnatural, unequal state of social order and social rights. Our system establishes and regulates social order upon the natural rights of man.
Who wrote that?
Morse. Jedediah Morse, the guy I'm talking about. Jedediah Morse founded the ABCFM. He's the guy that set up. He's the founder of this foreign missionary school. The first thing they do is they set up Indian schools.
Yeah.
Dartmouth College was an Indian school.
Wow.
Hamilton College was an Indian school.
Where's that?
Upstate New York.
Yeah, that's not far.
Look at what he says.
Syracuse and New York.
This is a great experiment. Look at this. The mental quality of the Native American are not in the least inferior to those of the Europeans, white people. That they are capable of all, even the most abstract sciences. And if equal care were taken of their education, we would see rise among them, the Native American, philosophers, mathematicians, and divines who would rival the first of Europe. That's what they're out to do. That's the American tradition. Okay? All this other stuff is bullshit. We came here and we drove the Indians out. Horse shit.
The Lord's Prayer in Cherokee.
They created a Cherokee language. Now, if you go Google Elias Boudinot, you know what the first thing that's going to come up? Is a Cherokee leader who took the name Elias Boudinot, who helped with the missionaries to create the written Cherokee language. He named himself Elias Boudinot. Okay? And of course, this is what Andrew Jackson deployed, on the Trail of Tears to drive west with the Indian Removal Act. But they did this all over. I said there was Dartmouth College, there was Indian schools everywhere. They set up in Connecticut, way up in the northwest corner of Connecticut, Cornwall, Connecticut, something they call a foreign mission school. This is fascinating. What they would do is they would take young men they would find, American seamen would find shipwrecked from different parts of, and they're looking for people from Asia particularly. And they would bring them to the foreign mission school, and they would teach them English, Greek, Latin, right? And then with the idea, and they of course would try to convert them to Christianity, right? And then the idea would be to take, these would be the ones that they would take with them back to their countries, and they would be the interpreters, etc., to recruit in their nation. So this is one guy here, Henry Obakaya, he was from Hawaiian. Manjiro was Japanese. He's the guy that ended up going with Admiral Perry back to Japan. Absolutely critical. Without him, it wouldn't happen because he wasn't just a translator. He was an interpreter culturally and every other thing. And there were all sorts of other people. The Indians went here. That the guy I was telling you about, Boudinot, he went here. He ended up. There was a big kerfuffle because he married an American, a white person. And anyway, everybody went bonkers.
Who did, oh, the Cherokee?
The
Cherokee.
Cherokee. It was supposed to be illegal, and the missionaries got in trouble because they were for it. Oh, it's bad. You could see these quotes I found in all this stuff. You know, like Spear would say, Chinese people should marry Americans. We should mix the races. It's amazing. It's just amazing. It's crazy. It's, you know. Anyway. So the first big success is Hawaii. And I could give a whole class on this. It's just amazing what they do. They take Obakaya, they get in the boat, they create the written Hawaiian language on the way there. So by the time they get there, they have a printing press with them. They have a written Hawaiian language. When they get there, they create a newspaper. I mean, it's incredible, right? And this is the basis, of course, later for Sun Yat-sen, who was in Hawaii, you know, which we're not going to talk about today.
So there was no written Hawaiian language
No.
before they went?
Yeah, exactly. This was all created by Americans. The British, and this freaked the British out because this ended. I show this because it's the you can see the little dot there and all the, it's being our intelligence post for the Pacific.
Right.
And one of the key missionaries, Damon, who's the father of the guy that knew Sun Yat-sen, was the intelligence operative in the Pacific. So all the seamen that would come in there, he'd gather all the intelligence, and you know, it was like the sounding post for all the boats coming in for Asia, China, whatever.
Whose map is that?
I don't know. It's just it's not anybody's map. It's just one that I found. Pedagogy. But this is an ABC-FM map, missions from 1810 to 1860. So you can see you have India, Thailand, Siam, Indonesia, Borneo, Japan, China, of course. There's Greece. I think there's Africa. There's a whole list here. South Africa, Turkey, Assyria, Ceylon, Singapore, you know, blah, 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 blah. This is the number of pages printed.
What is that, billion?
1,176,831,056 pages. Mostly Christian stuff, but you know, still, it's pretty good.
One for everybody in the room. That's not bad.
Okay. So, these are the two guys I want to talk about, because these are the Chinese guys. So, this is Dave Nabeel. He's from New Jersey. He's the son of a top George Washington collaborator. His father was a quartermaster, top quartermaster. His father secured all the tents for the Continental Army. Hey, that's important. You know, if you don't have a tent, that's what his father did. So Nabeel was ABC-FM. He first went to China in 1830, and he was sent on the first big reconnaissance mission. It was a recon mission. He just went to, not just to China, to all of Southeast Asia for like a year. And then he came back. And then he went back to China in 1842. Why 1842? Because that's the Treaty of Nanjing, the Opium War. What does that mean? It means that all the ports are open. Up until 1842, you could only go to Canton. That's the only port that's open. This is all ironic, right? But that's the reality of it, right? After 1842, these other ports are all open. Xiamen, these other ports. So he goes back in 1842, and we'll talk about Maori in a bit. And he meets up with the governor of Fujian province. Fujian province is right across from Taiwan. Shu Jiyu, it's this guy right here. And Xu Jiu is probably one of the top Confucian scholars in China at that time. And that's not just speculation. I mean, there's a merit system. So you go through examinations to become a top Confucian scholar. Right? And what Abele does, and this really gives you an idea of what the American missionary does. So Abele, I mean, immediately Xu Jiu picks up that this guy is different. That Abele's different. He's not some barbarian, Brit. I mean, he knows what the British are. He knows, and they do call him barbarian, by the way. Right? The Chinese do call him barbarian. So what Abele does is he sits down with this guy over days and gives him an entire strategic briefing of the entire world, including an in-depth briefing of the United States and the recent American Revolution, how we defeated the British, how we outflanked them, how Washington defeated the British, the whole thing, right? And Abele has with him maps. Abele's, by the way, fluent in Fukienese, not just Mandarin, but Fukienese, so he knows Chinese inside and out. And most of the British don't. In fact, at a certain point, Abele ends up being a translator for the British.
What's Fukienese?
Fukienese is the local dialect of Fujian province. So it's a little bit different. And what comes out of this, some years later, about 5 years later, is the first modern Chinese language geography, atlas, but they used to call them, it's not an atlas like we know of it today. Because then an atlas wasn't just maps, it was like an encyclopedia.
Right.
It's maps with descriptions, in-depth descriptions of every area, and then historical backgrounds, and the climate, and the whole thing. So that's what it was. It's called a brief analysis of the world.
Wow. Like an almanac?
Yeah, but yeah.
Like the kind of stuff the State Department puts out.
Yeah, right, exactly. So it's a whole, and there's nothing like this in China at all. Absolutely nothing like this. And I'll just give you that, show you.
What year was that?
1848. 1848. So this is the Western Hemisphere, and of course so part of this, of course, is these names where they created these names of some of these areas, these geographic locations. They're created by Abele and Xu Jiu. So there's North America, there's Europe. Oh yeah, it's totally accurate because it's from maps that Abele had. And there's the United States.
So was the country name of the United States as a beautiful country and Maple came from that?
Of course. I don't know. It doesn't say United States anymore. I'd have to look at. I'd like to. I've never been able to find this. Of course, you can't find it. I'd have to go to China to find the actual book in Chinese. Okay, now in the American part, what's the American part called? It's called America: New Nations Against Europe. That's the title of the American part. And the whole section is wonderful.
Yes,
But we don't have time to read the whole section, so I'm just going to read this part, right? It talks about, the guy falls in love with George Washington.
This is from that thing you just
It's from the Atlas.
Brief analysis.
Yeah, this is the American section. Each section's called, Africa, blah, blah, blah.
It's like our land bridge report.
Right, yeah, right. Except it's not a development, it's just it's an atlas. So he's talking about George Washington. It says, as for Washington, he was an extraordinary man in raising a revolt. He was more courageous than Sheng or Kuang. These are ancient Chinese heroes. In carrying out an occupation, he was braver than Cao or Liu. When he took up the 3-foot double-edged sword and opened up the boundaries for 10,000 li, he did not assume the throne and was unwilling to begin a line of succession. Wow. Moreover, he invented a method of selection, a world to be shared by all people. And he swiftly carried out the traditions of the Sandai, the ancients. He governed his states with reverence and respected good customs. He did not esteem military achievements. He was very different from those rulers of other states. I have seen his portrait. Abiel had a little replica of the Gilbert Stuart portrait.
Oh.
I have seen his portrait. His bearing is imposing and excellent. Ah, can he not be called a hero of all the famous Westerners of ancient and modern times? Can Washington be placed in any position but first? The Americans have not established titles of king from count, and they do not follow the rules of secession. The public organs are entrusted to public opinion. There has never been a system of this sort of in ancient or modern times. This is really a wonder. And that's in the Atlas and other stuff. It goes on. There's a whole description of how the revolution was won, battles. It's not, you know, it's not perfect. It's very general, right? And just to give you an idea.
Gotta put it back.
Wait, put it back, I'm gonna take a picture of it.
Oh, I can send you this. It's on a video. Now, anybody know where this is?
Washington.
Yeah, it's in the Washington Monument. In 1853, a group of Chinese students sent a section, I don't know if exactly this section, of this quote from this atlas of Yu, engraved in stone, to Washington, D.C. The Washington Monument was built in 1848 to 53, to be placed in the Washington Monument.
Oh, wow.
And it should still be there, I think. Here it is.
Was that common? Did other,
Yeah, there's other things there too, like that.
yeah, they were in, you can't read them, they were inside or they're outside?
It's inside, when you go inside.
I
Oh,
heard
I
there
didn't
a
know
wall
you
where
could
you
go
could see.
inside, huh?
Yeah.
You can climb it.
Oh, my God.
Yeah, it's up on the
No.
15th floor.
It's got the date. Anyway, so there's your project, you translate that. So. And what happened is that after, now Shujiu fell out of, once the, the Manchus didn't like the Confucians, because they looked at them as rivals. They didn't want to get them to get too uppity, right? So he was thrown out at a certain point of the governorship in Fujian province, but then he was brought back in because to defeat the Taiping, the Manchus had to bring the competent people back in, right? But and after the Burlingame Treaty, there was a school set up for Chinese that were going to go and study abroad, and one of the required readings was the Shujiyu's Atlas. So this became the manual for Chinese for foreign service and etc. So this trained a whole generation of Confucian patriots, is what I call them. So in case you're wondering why, in 24 hours the entire Qing army went to Sun Yat-sen after one revolt in 1911. This just didn't come out of nowhere. That's the second class. That's another class. Okay, so I'm going to briefly talk about him. So this is another missionary. He's not with ABCFM. He's with the Presbyterians, but it doesn't matter. It's really the same thing, because at a certain point around the 1840s, does anybody have a sense of what's going on in the United States in terms of presidents and stuff? Yeah, that's right. You get all the assholes are in the presidency from basically.
There's a revolution going on in Europe at the same time in 48.
Yeah, but the 1830s, 40s, 50s, it's all like, I'll come back to that. But anyway, the ABCFM is taken over by one of these Brahmins, all right? So it's really tough to do anything. So a lot of people end up going, there's a Presbyterian board of foreign missions, and a lot of the Patriots ended up jumping over to that. So this is one of them, Walter Lowry, whose father is a senator from Pennsylvania, who's a top patriot from Pennsylvania. So Lowry ends up joining Abiel in that same period, 1842, while Abiel is, with Shujiyu. And Lowry is stationed in Ningpo, which is up here. So you see that's Shanghai. Ningpo is, this is the Bay of Hangzhou. This is Xiamen. That's where Abil is. That's Fujian is here. Okay. And one of the things that they do right after the Treaty of Nanjing, I guess it's in 43, is Lowry and Abil decide that they're going to take it's like 3 or 4 month expedition upriver. It's a small river, it's not a famous river, into the interior, which pisses off the British. They really get in trouble. They almost get killed. So anyway, shows you what these guys are like, right? So I don't know more about it. I just know this from their memoirs. They don't talk about it. That's the other thing. You can't get much. These are all like intelligence operations. So you don't get too much out of these memoirs when you read these. Because they're not going to talk about it. Because they're written relatively contemporary when they're doing it, right? So Lowry's stationed in Ningpo. Lowry's a remarkable guy. He's completely fluent. Literate, I shouldn't say fluent, literate in Chinese. That is reading, writing, speaking. He sets up the largest library in Ningpo, Chinese library. He writes to his father, he says, look, I'm going to set up, what's missing is we need to have an index of all of the top Confucian terms, vocabulary. So he sets up a library of Confucian vocabulary from the 4 books and the 4 books of Confucius and the 5 Qing, which are the ancient texts. And so he does all that, and there's nothing like that anywhere. And then he says, well, this isn't good enough. I'm going to do something different. Next slide. This are the 4 books. Mencius, Doctrine of the Being, Da Shui, and the Analects. So that's those 4 books. And then the 5 Qing are the ancient classics that Confucius resurrected and pulled together, right, as the ancient books of the Chinese ancients, right? The Book of Odes, the Book of Music, etc. So he decides, he writes to his father saying, look, I'm going to embark on the biggest project ever. I'm going to do the first ever English translation of the entirety of the Chinese classics. 4 books in 5 Qing.
Wow.
Yeah, big deal, right? So this was like, wow, And about a month or 2 after he announces this, he's going on a boat from Ningpo back over to Shanghai, and the boat's attacked by pirates and he's murdered. And everybody knows what pirates and the British are. So basically, as far as I'm concerned, he's assassinated by the British, because that's a real threat to the British.
Did he publish his books?
He never did it.
He never did because he was
Yeah, he was killed. He
assassinated.
was murdered, so he couldn't do it.
That's what happened.
And who ended up translating all of these works? The British pig, Legge. Legge, the guy that fostered these Taiping crazies. He's the one that ends up being, if you go to the library and you want to get the Analects. Yes, to this day. Can you imagine if Lowry would have lived to this today, we'd be reading his translations of Confucius. So, there you go.
Well, can some of our people retranslate Confucius into real words?
Easier
On
said
the
than
day
done.
off.
He also, the other thing that Lowry did is he set up, now I've seen people say the first metal type for Chinese printing. I don't know if that's true or not. I've read that that's what it is. I guess the other type, I know that they had Chinese type before that, but I guess it was wooden or something. So he actually created metal Chinese type.
I'm sorry, who did this?
Lowry, the same guy. So this guy was like 30-something years, young, right? Can you imagine what this guy would have created, right? And this is back to this point of the presidents, right? So this is 1837 to 1861, so you know, all the nitwits and the traitors and the British lackeys Van Buren, Tyler, I skipped the guys that died from, you know, eating cherries and getting the cold, all those things, right? But this is the problem. So through this whole period, so you have these guys, these missionaries doing these wonderful things, but you have nothing until you have the Civil War and Lincoln, and then Burlingame, and then once you have the a presidency, then you can have the Burlingame Treaty, and it's a completely different matter. So anyway, that's really all I have for the moment.
I have a
Just-
question.
Yeah.
The Burlingame Treaty, what does it say? What is it about? Is it about
It
trade?
basically says it's basically says that that China is the most favored nation status with the United States. This is what Spear says about the Burlingame Treaty. He says this is his conception of the treaty. He says this treaty defines and fixes the principles of the intercourse of Western nations with China. It secures the territorial integrity of the empire and concedes to China the rights which the civilized nations of the world accord to each other as to eminent domain over land and waters and jurisdiction over persons and property therein. It takes the first step toward the appointment of Chinese consuls in our seaports, a measure promotive of both Chinese and American interests. Promotive. It secures exemption from all disability or persecution on account of religious faith in either country. It recognizes the right of voluntary emigration and makes penal the wrongs of the coolie traffic. It pledges privileges as to travel or residence in either country, such as are enjoyed by the most favored nation. It grants to the Chinese the permission to attend our schools and colleges, and allows us to freely establish and maintain schools in China. And while it acknowledges the right of the Chinese government to control its own whole interior arrangements as to railroads, telegraphs, and other internal improvements, it suggests the willingness of our government to afford aid toward their construction by designating and authorizing suitable engineers to perform the work at the expense of the Chinese government. While slavery existed in the United States, the Senate would not have ratified a national covenant which accords so freely the right of equal humanity and equal civilization to a tawny race not of European blood. That covenant will be kept with good faith on our part. It is in harmony with the article of the Constitution recently adapted, the 14th Amendment, which says that no state shall deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of its laws. This article we accept as the text of the Constitution, of which this treaty is but one example. Interesting, right? It must sweep away the legal disabilities to which the Chinese have been subjected on the Pacific coast, permit them to obtain the sheer rights of humanity, and punish the villains who now plunder, abuse, or murder them under the assurance that the testimony of that race will be rejected by the courts. So that was my point about this one. So that treaty never would have been signed, you know, in 1860, 1849, or 1852.
It'd be nice when she comes here that he would quote this to the American people.
Yeah, right.
You know.
Especially the idea of setting up schools and whatnot. in
Yeah,
other
yeah,
countries.
yeah. Some violations going on.
Yeah. Now, is the Burlingame Treaty still in effect? I mean, it was never overridden or?
No, it was repealed with the Exclusion Act.
Oh.
That's the whole thing. We'll have to go through this. I mean, what happened is that this was in effect for like 30 years. This guy that wrote the book on the railroads, he wrote a whole history of this. He says basically, because It's an interesting guy. I gotta call the guy up, because he basically says, you know, the narrative in the United States is that Americans, the yellow peril, they hate Chinese. He said, this is all bullshit. If this were true, why did it take 30 years to overthrow the Burlingame Treaty to get the Exclusion Act? It took 30 years. Well, it didn't just happen overnight, because it did take 30 years. And even then, it was hard to do it. Because it wasn't until 1892, ultimately, that you had the Geary Exclusion Act that basically said, no more Chinese, yellow peril, out Chinese, you can't be citizens, get out, blah, 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 blah. So that overthrew everything.
And that was what,
1892.
Same year Carnot was assassinated.
Right.
And the same years, like around the Jim Crow.
Jim
and
Crow,
all that.
yeah.
Yeah.
was-
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly the same.
Right.
And then the Dreyfus affairs 2 years later.
Well, I did a whole class on that. I mean, everybody starts being killed. Because this is the rise of Club of the Isles, the whole wave of assassinations. It all leads. This is all leading to World War I.
And the Patriots kind of had to go under the ground.
Yeah, right.
One would think that the intelligentsia at the level of Xi and his grouping would know the profundity of the identity of the United States in history and
Right.
its identity today. And would, maybe that in part is expressed by their extreme patience in terms of dealing with current insane U.S. policy. I know I was shocked recently speaking to a high-level Russian government official who was outraged by the sanctions and the war, what the war party is doing. But this person went through in detail how when the United States was born, there was a new existence on the planet.
Yeah, you mentioned it.
And no nation, no man had ever seen a nation with the conception of the individual, conception of the universe that was expressed by the founding fathers. And this person said to me, so what we're asking ourselves, what happened? What happened? Can you tell me what happened? So I have a sense that within a certain elite in these nations, there is an awe and a respect
Yeah.
for the genius of Washington and that generation.
Well, think about
carried out
that,
the
that
revolution.
space video, whichever the China one or two, whenever they did that, and they had America the Beautiful,
Yeah,
Yeah,
and the background
exactly.
music, they're like, hello, where are you?
Yeah, right. Anybody else?
We'll find you in space.
Yes.
What was the Chinese word for barbarian?
I don't know. Michael. I don't know.
No, that's too polite.
Well, maybe we should thank you, that was.
Thanks,